Joni Lamb spent decades teaching millions of people that healing begins with confession, that pain loses its power the moment it is spoken out loud, that silence is where suffering grows. And yet, when the final chapter of her own life arrived, she chose silence. Total silence. No public battle. No emotional goodbye. No emotional goodbye. No revelation from the woman who built an empire by asking other people to reveal everything. And maybe that is the first contradiction you have to sit with, because the woman who helped create one of the most powerful Christian broadcasting empires on earth did not let the audience see what was happening behind the curtain. Not the illness, not the fractures inside the family, not the growing tension surrounding the network, not the emotional collapse quietly unfolding while the cameras continued rolling like nothing had changed. The official statement announcing her death was brief, almost painfully brief. Just enough words to confirm she was gone, but not enough to explain what really happened. For viewers who had watched her for decades, the silence felt strange, not respectful, strategic. And the deeper people looked, the stranger the story became, because this was never just about a death. It was about power, about image, about loyalty, about a ministry that preached transparency while carefully controlling its own narrative behind closed doors. And somewhere in the middle of all of it sat Joni Lamb. Mother, broadcaster, survivor, builder, and depending on who you ask, either a woman protecting her family or a woman protecting an empire. The public knew her as the calm voice at the center of Daystar Television Network, a global Christian media empire reaching billions of households worldwide. For decades, she sat under studio lights discussing faith, healing, redemption, relationships, forgiveness. She built an image around emotional openness, around vulnerability, around the idea that no wound was too ugly to bring into the light. But the unsettling thing about public vulnerability is that sometimes it becomes performance, not necessarily fake, just selective. Because while audiences were hearing conversations about healing, there were reportedly fractures forming much closer to home. Quiet ones at first, the kind families convince themselves will eventually disappear if nobody speaks too loudly about them. But silence has a way of growing, and eventually, the public image people spend decades constructing starts colliding with private reality. That collision became impossible to ignore after the death of her husband, Marcus Lamb. For years, Marcus and Joni were presented almost like spiritual royalty within Christian broadcasting. They built Daystar together from the ground up, transforming it into one of the largest faith-based television networks in the world. Their story was sold as perseverance, faith under pressure, marriage surviving storms. But even before his death, cracks in that image had already become public. Years earlier, Marcus admitted to an extramarital affair during an emotional on-air confession. It was one of the most uncomfortable moments in Christian television history. Millions watched as a ministry built around morality suddenly had to explain scandal from inside its own walls. And this is where Joni's public image became even more complicated, because she stayed. Not quietly either, publicly. She framed forgiveness almost as a spiritual assignment, as if enduring humiliation itself had become part of the testimony. To supporters, it looked powerful. To critics, it looked tragic. But either way, it revealed something important about the emotional culture surrounding the ministry. Image survival mattered deeply. Then Marcus died in 2021 after battling COVID-19, and suddenly, Joni was no longer standing beside the empire's co-founder. She was the face of it, the emotional center, the surviving architect. And what happened next changed everything, because grief did not arrive alone. Change arrived with it. Less than 2 years after Marcus's death, Joni remarried. And on paper, that should not have been scandalous. People move forward, life continues. But inside the Daystar ecosystem, where doctrine, image, loyalty, and family were deeply intertwined, the remarriage reportedly triggered tensions that were already quietly building beneath the surface. Particularly with her son, Jonathan. And this is where the story stops feeling like celebrity gossip and starts feeling painfully human. because behind the polished ministry image was now a family struggling over belief, authority, trust, and control. Jonathan reportedly raised concerns about the remarriage and the theological implications surrounding it. But what made the situation explosive was not simply disagreement. Families disagree all the time. It was what allegedly happened afterward: claims of internal pressure, non-disclosure agreements, institutional loyalty tests. The feeling, according to critics, that questioning leadership inside the ministry had become almost spiritually dangerous. And once those accusations entered public conversation, the story became impossible to contain. Because now viewers were no longer just asking, "What happened to the family?" They were asking, what exactly was happening inside Daystar? The network denied wrongdoing. Allegations circulated, investigations followed. Supporters defended the ministry. Critics saw patterns of control. And somewhere inside all that noise sat a devastating reality nobody could fully argue away. A mother and son had become publicly estranged. And the emotional weight of that fact hit harder after her death. Reports began circulating that Jonathan learned about parts of the situation through public channels rather than private family communication. Whether people blame institutional breakdown, emotional distance, unresolved conflict, or years of accumulated pain, the image itself was heartbreaking. A family that spent decades teaching reconciliation, struggling to reach it themselves. And maybe that is why this story resonates so deeply with people who were never even Daystar viewers. Because underneath the religion, the television empire, the money, and the controversy is a fear almost everyone understands. What if success costs you the people closest to you? That question became even heavier once conversations about money entered the picture. Because Daystar was not a small operation. This was a media empire tied to massive reach, expensive properties, luxury lifestyles, and enormous influence. Critics had long questioned how prosperity theology and extreme wealth coexist comfortably beside messages of sacrifice and spiritual humility. Then came the reports about pandemic relief funds and private jet controversy, and suddenly the optics became devastating. A ministry receiving relief money while associated with luxury travel created exactly the kind of contradiction critics had been talking about for years. Again, supporters defended the decisions. Critics saw hypocrisy, but perception matters, especially when your entire public identity is built around morality and trust. And here is the uncomfortable truth most powerful institutions eventually face: people can forgive mistakes. What they struggle to forgive is contradiction, especially repeated contradiction. By this point, Joni Lamb's story had become emotionally impossible to simplify into hero or villain, because real people rarely fit cleanly into either category. She built something extraordinary. That part is true. Millions of viewers genuinely found comfort in her broadcasts. Many people credit Daystar programming with helping them survive grief, addiction, loneliness, spiritual crisis. You cannot erase that impact simply because controversy exists beside it. But controversy did exist beside it. That is also true. And the tension between those truths is exactly what makes this story so emotionally difficult to process. Because the same woman who inspired healing in strangers may have died carrying unresolved pain inside her own family. The same ministry, built on openness, became increasingly associated with secrecy. The same public figure who spent years discussing emotional freedom appeared in the end, surrounded by emotional walls nobody could fully penetrate. Not the audience, not critics, maybe not even the people closest to her. And then came the final revelation that changed how many people viewed her final years altogether: the reports surrounding her health. Metastatic cancer, a devastating diagnosis reportedly kept largely private until the very end. And suddenly, the silence surrounding her final chapter started feeling different, less strategic, more tragic. Because it forced people to reconsider the possibility that behind all the controversy, all the institutional tension, all the headlines, there may also have been fear, exhaustion, denial. A woman privately confronting mortality while publicly trying to hold together an empire already showing signs of fracture. That does not erase criticism, but it complicates it. And complicated stories are harder for the internet to process. The engineers it prefers certainty, heroes, villains, clean endings. But this story refuses to become clean. That is the uncomfortable part. And perhaps that is the real reason this story keeps pulling people back in. Not the rumors, not the money, Not even the scandals, the contradiction, the emotional dissonance of a woman who spent decades helping strangers confess their pain while hiding so much of her own. In the end, the broadcasts continued. The cameras stayed on. The institution survived. But survival and healing are not always the same thing. And maybe that is the question lingering over everything Joni Lamb left behind. What happens when the image survives, but the relationships underneath it don't? Because long after the statements fade and the headlines disappear, that is the part people remember. Not the network, not the properties, not even the controversy, the distance, the silence. The feeling that somewhere behind the polished television lighting was a family slowly losing the ability to reach one another while the world kept watching. And maybe the saddest part of all is this. For someone who spent her life teaching people to speak truth out loud, the most important truths surrounding her life only fully emerged after she was gone. If this story changed the way you see Joni Lamb, leave your thoughts below, because the conversation around her legacy is far from over.